Hello, Bezel 333. Now, John Lash, he calls himself a comparative mythologist. He's the author of 5 books, the latest of which is called Not in His Image. Now, I can't find any formal training in his biography, but he does say that he spent time in Belgium at the Catholic University of Leuven studying the ancient Gnostic text. Now, in his book, he proposes that the pagans were systematically destroyed by the Christians over the first 4 centuries. He states that the story of the Bible is false and tries to show that the Gnostic texts are able to prove this by arguing against the concept that we are made in the image of God. So what I want to do is comment not so much on his book per se, but on the things that he says about his book in an interview that he conducted that was on this website. So that's what I want to do, comment on what he says and give my point of view, okay?
But the Nag Hammadi documents that were discovered in Egypt are really the principal focus right now of Gnostic studies.
So the first thing he's telling us is that the primary source for what he knows and what he's able to study about Gnosticism comes from the Nag Hammadi documents that were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945.
These Coptic texts that we're relying on to know about Gnosticism were written in Coptic, which is not really a true language. It's a language that was invented around 100 BC in order to translate hieroglyphics into a kind of shorthand.
Okay, so John's being very honest here. He's telling us that Coptic is a very difficult language, and that it is a translation from hieroglyphics. That's helpful. I didn't know that. But what I want to do here, this is what we're leading to, is to show the reliability of the Nag Hammadi documents in comparison to the accounts of the Gospel as found in the New Testament.
If you go into a bookstore, I would advise you to look through the Nag Hammadi library in English before you buy it,
okay.
Because a great deal of it is incomprehensible. It's gibberish. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, now he's going on to talk about the translation of the Nag Hammadi documents into the Nag Hammadi library in English, which is the primary English translation for all these documents. And again, he's not placing a lot of confidence, in my mind, in what he's saying. So if I wanted to be a Gnostic and I had to go to the primary source for English for these documents, he's pretty much telling me not to waste my time.
And even the scholars who are translating these Coptic texts point out that they're full of grammatical errors. They are difficult to understand. The grammar is complex and confusing.
Okay, so from what he said so far, I don't have a lot of confidence in these documents. Now, what's so curious to me is we have a practicing Gnostic who wrote a book saying not in his image, based upon the Nag Hammadi documents, who is placing all kinds of doubt in at least my mind as to the reliability of these documents. And yet, I found a New Testament scholar by the name of Mark Roberts. He's a PhD. And he has something very different to say about the reliability of the Nag Hammadi documents. Listen to what he says.
I mean, and for one thing, most of the Gnostic Gospels that we have are in Coptic through the Nag Hammadi library, even though it's likely that most of them were written in Greek. So it's sometimes that, I mean, the way people talk about that may even be a bit problematic. But, you know, the translations that we have in the Nag Hammadi library, for example, are written by some of the finest Coptic and Gnostic scholars in the world. Whatever you might think of some of their views, they are excellent linguists. And so what they represent to us is pretty reliable.
The prominent Gnostic scholars today, such as this woman Elaine Pagels, listeners may have heard of her because she wrote the Gnostic Gospels, are religious scholars. They have positions in universities. They're deeply respected. They've studied the Coptic language. They've probably been to Egypt and all that. But there is one thing that they are not. They are not practicing mystics. So I would ask you, how can someone who is not a practicing mystic translate mystical literature?
Okay, I find this argument really hard to follow, because what I would want, if I want someone to translate a document for me in a particular language, I don't want that person so much to be experienced in what the language teaches, but rather what the language says, and to be able to translate it correctly. So I'm not exactly sure what he's saying, that someone has to be a practicing Gnostic to be able to translate Coptic into English. What you need to do is do a good job translating Coptic into English, which is what Mark Roberts said has been done.
And fortunately, no, I am not proficient in Coptic. I am not a Coptic scholar. I cannot read Coptic fluently.
Okay, so John tells us now that he's not a Coptic scholar, that he can't read Coptic fluently. So where is he getting his information? Well, it seems to me he'd have to get most of it from the English translation, which he doesn't trust, and then he would go back to the Coptic, which he doesn't understand very well. But then he goes on to say something incredible.
That Coptic, which is an invented language, borrows its words from Greek. And so about 1 in every 4 words in the Coptic language is actually just a Greek word. So, and I know Greek fairly well.
But doesn't that go back to, well, why wouldn't the scholars, the linguists who did these translations, if it's every 4th word in Greek, wouldn't they do a good job? I just don't get what this guy is talking about. But what I want to do now is contrast just some facts about the Nag Hammadi documents as opposed to the 4 accounts of the one gospel of Jesus Christ as found in the New Testament. Okay, just a couple quick comparisons of these 2 types of documents. Now, the Nag Hammadi documents were found to be written around 150 to 250 AD, as opposed to the 4 accounts of the Gospel, which date back, and scholars have pretty much nailed this down, back to this AD 60, maybe 75. This is within 30 years of the actual events. Another thing that needs to be said is the amount of manuscript evidence itself that's in existence. For the Gnostics, it's basically what's in the Nag Hammadi documents themselves. But for the New Testament, which the Gospels are found, it's an immense amount of documentation. It's an immense amount of manuscripts. I would say 5,000 or so Greek manuscripts that are in existence today, either in part or in total, that date within 100 years of the original autographs. Now, there's a couple things we need to keep in mind about the Gospels. One, we need to understand that oral tradition, the passing down of information orally, was the best, really, that they could do in the 1st century, and people were very concerned about accuracy, especially with the type of information being passed on. These people really believed that Jesus was God in human flesh, and that people's eternal destinies depended on what they did with the person of Jesus Christ. So their motivation to accurately transmit this information, these accounts, orally, was very strong. That's one thing. 2, if this religion was basically made up or started, why on earth would the people that start it use 2 out of the 4 gospel writers that aren't even intimately or first person connected with Jesus? Both Luke and Mark are at least 1 or 2 people separated from Jesus. Why wouldn't they, like the Gnostic Gospels, which are so far later, use all these first-person names? The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, right? So think about these things. Think about the reliability. I'm not trying to argue right now for the truthfulness of the claims made in the 4 Gospel accounts in the New Testament. All I'm telling you is that if we look at them from the standpoint of secular literature, it can be trusted. Now, whether you believe the claims or not is a different story. What I want to get into next, and I'm going to run out of time here, but in my next kind of part 2 of this talk, I want to talk or comment on what John Lash has to say about Christianity in specific. So please stay tuned, come back and watch part 2.